great to see you all. Some familiar faces from the other events yesterday and today, some new ones. My name is Sergio Preston. I am an architectural theorist, currently doing a presidential postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton. We're going through families and their homes through the interwar period in Europe and the US. I'm here to introduce two phenomenal speakers, for which I've written notes. So it's my pleasure today to present Jack Halberstam, who's a professor of gender studies and English at Columbia University. Halberstam is the author of 7 books, including Skin Shows, Gothic Horror, and the Technology of Monsters from Duke University Press, Female Masculinity, also from Duke Press, In a Queer Time and Place, NYU from 2005, A Queer Art of Failure, Personal Favorite, 2011, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and Normal, and a short book called Trans, A Quick and Quirky Account of Gender Variance from the University of California Press, 2018. A lot of you probably know some of these titles. Halberstam's latest book, I do from Duke University Press in 2020, is called Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire. Places Journal awarded Halberstam's Artist Faces Prize 2018 for Innovative Public Scholarship. Relationship to Gender, Sexuality, Ability, and Environment. Halberstam is now finishing a second volume on wildness, titled The Wild Beyond Music, Architecture, and Anarchy.
No, I'll just correct that before we move on, which is just to say it's not a second volume and that's a title.
New conception.
It's its own standalone.
Hot off the presses.
Yes.
It's not something.
Thank you.
And it's also my pleasure to introduce Damon, who's Associate Professor of French and Film and Media at the University of California, Berkeley, where he teaches the program of critical theory. Young is author of Making Sense Public, Other Cinematic Fantasies, published by Duke Press in 2018, and shortlisted for the Association for the Study of Collective Present, as well as numerous essays on film theory, psychoanalysis, queer theory, photography, and digital media. He is co-editor and most recently of Meme Aesthetics, a special issue of Representations, and his current book project, Century of the Selfie, is forthcoming from Harvard University Press. And I also want to say that I attended the workshop put on this morning by both professors and Young. Their knowledge is encyclopedic, their attention is extraordinarily clear, and their generosity is overwhelming. It was just incredible to witness firsthand. If we reminded how in the right hands, pedagogy, conversation, making space for sharing perspectives about a common topic is probably one of the most effective tools for building community and strengthening resistance. So thanks very much to both of you. Now Professor Halberstam will speak, followed by a response from Professor Damon, after which we'll open up the conversation. Thank you.
All right, so first of all, thank you to Sergio for agreeing to be our moderator and also for the work that he presented today. Second, let me say, Damon is going to pick up some threads from my talk, which he's familiar with, but he's also going to present his own work along the lines of some of the topics that we discussed today in the workshop. And then last but not least, thank you to Sophie for putting on this extraordinary event. That has brought many conversations into play about art, architecture, space, and politics. And that's what we're here to talk about this evening. I'm going to present to you some research that I've been doing for the better part of the last decade on an art movement, an art collective really, from the 1970s called the Anarchitecture Collective. The main practitioner of this collective was a guy called Gordon Matta Clark, and it's his legacy that mostly lives on under the heading of Anarchitecture. So what I'll try to do in this talk is give you a sense of what Anarchitecture is, and there'll be plenty of people here who know exactly what it is. There's a lot of architecture theorists in the room or art historians in the room, so I won't belabor it, but I will explain how and why somebody who's interested in queer and trans theory, want to go back to this straight guy who's become quite a hero in some ways. In recent years, people have really returned to his work. And what I want to explain as I go is how I'm drawing from it a language. I'm taking from Anarchitecture and the cuts that it performs, a kind of language for describing the trans body now. The trans body not as a site of identity that you can either cathect onto or reject, but the trans body as an entity that is in conversation with and part of the built environment, and that in the politics of trans, there are other politics collecting that have to do with gentrification, with abandonment, with dispossession, dereliction, destitution, and many other things. And this is a very different way of explaining trans than either the medical or the legal languages that we prefer. When you go the legal route, you ask for rights and recognition, and as we can see in the fascist conjuncture that we currently live in, those rights and recognitions can easily be withdrawn. When you go the medical route, your choice is either pathology or acceptance, okay? So those we want to reject out of hand, and the benefit of going with a kind of aesthetic approach to trans, and an aesthetic that has embedded within it a deep political commitment to anarchy and to thinking differently about the urban landscape. In that way, we can actually connect trans to real things other than just, I'm here, I'm trans, I want you to see who I am. That's not how trans bodies operate in the world. They operate very often as part of very complex solidarities, and that's how we're going to situate transness, okay? Along the way, there'll be heroes and there'll be goats, and my main goat tonight will be the figure of Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson was a gay architect, and that's how we know we're not in an identity project, because Johnson is going to be the antagonist of the story that I tell you. So there's a straight guy who's going to be the person crafting a language for us with which to articulate opposition and resistance differently, and there'll be a gay guy who is in fact building the world that we now live in and that we are here to contest, okay? And that scrambles our usual political coordinates and forces us to think differently about gay, straight, opposition, resistance, conformity, compliance, and so on. So I'll move through my slides and just try to make sense of this material as I go. This is Matt Clark, and you can see him working on Day's End. Over there in the corner, there's a video. He takes his shirt off, he uses power tools. It's like a very macho endeavor, Anarchitecture, but at any rate, if you even looked at Day's End, you'll know that the main vocabulary of Anarchitecture is the unbuilding of things, okay? So if architecture, as the name implies, is this sort of the master builder, okay? Anarchitecture is the anarchic undoing and unbuilding and unmaking of things, of worlds. And that's the project that is so resonant today. I think that the reason people are interested again in Anarchitecture is precisely because we deeply recognize how urgent it is for us to unmake this world that we live in and that we are deeply responsible for, that we have made, out of which there are very, very few roots. So therefore, one wants to create the conditions for the next generation to take the whole thing down. So you'll see if you look at his dates, 1943 to 1978, he didn't live long. So this is quite a small archive. I personally love small archives. You can really get into the nitty-gritty, work with each piece very, very closely. Not only is it a small archive, however, it is an archive interested in smallness. One of Matt Clark's words, and he amassed this really interesting vocabulary in addition to Anarchitecture, one of his words is monumental, monumental. as in a critique of the monumentality with which architectures seek to leave their mark on the world, on the city. And of course, Salzburg is a perfect example of that. It is teeming with monumental buildings, beautiful as they are built to last, they are built to be monuments to particular orders, political orders, historical orders of being that are not here anymore, but that live on through the built environment. That was the goal, by the way, of fascist architecture, was to be permanent. And Albert Speer, for example, big hero of Philip Johnson's, his idea was to create buildings that not only would live on, but if they fell into ruination, would look beautiful as ruins as well. So this is a kind of whole plan of permanence and longevity that is built into a kind of fascist sensibility. By contrast, someone like Mata Clark is making a cut, usually into a building that is slated for demolition. None of his pieces remain. There is not a single work by Mata Clark that is still available for you to say. And what I like to say about one of Mata Clark's most significant works, which was called Splitting, I'll show it to you in a moment, was it is one of the most important works of art of the 20th century. And it's a work that maybe 20 people saw, right? And so you can see that the point is not the image of the split building simply. It's the gestural politics of making a split into a house that lives on. And what lives on is not the house or simply the tools that cut the house or even the video or the photograph. What lives on is that void that was introduced into the structure. So Mata Clark died in 1978 of pancreatic cancer. He came from a long lineage of artists. His mother, Anne Clark, was an artist. His father, Roberto Mata, was a Chilean artist. He grew up and lived in New York City. He went to Cornell to study architecture with people like Eisenman, art with Robert Smithson, and from Smithson he's gains an interest in things like entropy. He came back to New York City, a city that was bankrupt and falling down, okay? And we should remember that it was bankrupt precisely because local government insisted on giving free tuition to people through the city college system and giving free health care to the poorer boroughs. And the federal government said, we don't do that. So we're not giving you any more funding because this isn't a socialist country. Tuition isn't free. Medical care isn't free, and if you want federal funding, you'll start charging for these things. So under those conditions, New York City was broke, not simply, it was corrupt, it was run by mafiosa, nepotistic politicians and so on, but that's not the only reason. So into that city, Mata Clark returns from graduate school and decides that he's going to use his architectural training not to build things, but to unbuild things. And so he would scour the city looking for abandoned sites. And in those abandoned sites, he would carve shapes. And those shapes were nothing. Okay? So when we're looking for a Mata Clark piece, we are looking for the shape of nothing, a cut, a split, a void, or as he put it, a vacancy. It was important to him that the buildings were abandoned, he says, because the absence of owners really liberates the space. The absence of owners really liberates the space. Remember that this is an anarchist project, and at the very heart of anything called anarchy is a critique of the regime of property and all the forms of being that rest upon the property regime. So if we believe in the individual as a possession, a possessive investment in selfhood, or a possessed individual being, then Anarchitecture opens onto a different way of understanding self. Not as something you have, not even necessarily as something that you are, but as something that you are constantly unbecoming, and that you are in a process of disintegrating in some ways. So that, lies at the very heart of Anarchitecture. Here are just some of this is pre-internet, pre-phones, pre all that stuff. Mata Clark wrote on note cards, and these note cards are all collected, and these are just some of the aphoristic statements that typify the language of Anarchitecture. What really excites me is the undoing. Nothing works. Form follows function. Anarchitecture seeks to solve no problem. So the last one is a response to Le Corbusier, who said social problems can be resolved by either architecture or revolution. He chose architecture. Matt Clark chose revolution. Okay? So Anarchitecture, according to this dictum of revolution, the anarchitect must not set out to solve a problem, because the problem in a city is usually cast as poor people, people of color, people who are derelict. Those are the problems in the city. That's what constitutes urban blight. So Anarchitecture seeks to solve no problem and refuses to say that those are the problems to be solved. Okay, so again, you can hear the anarchic project in this statement. Nothing works is important for the project that Damon and I were unfolding this morning, because as we were saying in the workshop, nothing does work. You know, it doesn't just sit there as a blot or a stain. It's an undoing logic that moves against Western philosophy. I mean, in some ways, it's at the very heart of metaphysics through somebody like Heidegger, but as the Afro-pessimists tell us, Heidegger's nothing is not the same as this dispossessive nothing that really seeks to destroy the world imagined and built by Western Enlightenment. Okay? These are the buildings that we'll somehow talk about in the course of our time together. On the left is the Glass House, which is Philip Johnson's enduring legacy, and it is, I want you to start thinking about, for me anyway, a kind of fascist architecture that proposes that there's nothing to see, that everything is neutral, that the best building is a kind of transparent order. And of course, that building itself was an imitation of Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House, which he did not get around to building until much later than Johnson. So Johnson looked at the blueprint for the Farnsworth House and built his first, okay? And I'll tell you about Johnson in a bit, because his biography is just insane. But all you need to know at the moment is that was built in 1949, right after the war. He's a very wealthy man. His behavior during World War II is beyond reprehensible, but he's wealthy, he's rich, and he survives very, very well and builds this glass house, which in many ways is a statement about an architecture through which wealthy people will gaze at everybody else. And my colleague at Columbia, Andres Hacker, has a whole thing about transparency and these glass towers in New York City through which the wealthy look on the city as if there's no barrier between them and the city that they own. So that transparency that we love so much as a kind of mid-century aesthetic maybe should give us pause. Maybe we want to think about it some more. Mies van der Rohe is a guy who, remember, was famous for saying, less is more. Is less more in Mies van der Rohe? I don't think so. Between the two of them, Johnson and Mies van der Rohe definitely let us know that more will always be more. They built towers in New York City that have become landmarks, and not only landmarks in terms of the landscape and the cityscape, but landmarks in terms of investment opportunities. So most of these places are owned by very, very wealthy investors in the cityscape. Finally, here's a Matt Clark, splitting 1974, and this is where Matt Clark's architectural training was important, because what he wanted to do was take this house slated for demolition, in which a black family had been living until the very moment that the land was repossessed, and they were moved out, shunted out by white flight to the suburbs. So white people move out of the city using loans in the post-war period given to them by the government, loans that were not given to black people, by the way. So into the suburbs move white people, and black people are moved further and further out from the center of activity. So into this house, you could say that Matt Clark introduces a split to represent the vacancy of the people who are not there. I'm not saying that it does represent that, because these are deeply non-representational gestures, but I'm saying we can read the absence of the family that has been removed into the cut as what is not there. You can read many things in terms of what is not there, but you can also read it as an assault on the property regime that says, we're going to move this house out of the way and build another one, and each house will increase in value in a speculative economy in which people who can invest in property will do very well. People who have been property will never, ever catch up. And that has been the exact story of real estate in USA in the 20th century. Black people never did catch up, and white people own everything. And we see where that gets us today, where not only are we, buying everything from all these wealthy people, now they govern us as well. So we're at the very end of the regime of property that Matt Clark was worried about in the 1970s, which is why he was critical of architecture, conventional professional architecture. He saw that it was the handmaiden to real estate, and he saw that real estate was coming as a new form of speculative and dispossessive capital, and that we needed to start working with these abandoned spaces on behalf of a different economic reality, which never happened, and here we are. We've done this, so we will move on. Final cut, I never quite managed this, but I do believe in it. The final cut would be to cut Anarchitecture loose from the charismatic biography of Matt Clark, because if it's just another art history of a cool white guy who did things that everyone else thinks is great, then we're just smack in the middle of a kind of art historical paradigm. But I believe, in keeping with Matt Clark's own orientation towards dispossession, we should remove Anarchitecture simply from this art historical site and this biographical detail, make the final cut of Matt Clark himself, and allow this discourse to be more free-floating so that it can teach us other things than what his cuts depicted. Now, we will come back to Day's End in a moment, but I'm going to quickly, I want to do this next piece kind of quickly, just to build a little bit on work that Damon and I have done together in various seminars. I want to propose that particularly a queer history must work with the nothing on behalf of something that I'm going to call a deflationary history. And this will allow me to set up Philip Johnson for the roasting that I'm going to give him later on, while steering clear of the potential homophobia of that gesture. So I take, I'm a student of queer theory, and I've been well taught by the foundational texts such as John D'Amelio's Capitalism and Gay Identity, in which D'Amelio explains that capitalism, and particularly gay men, enter the 20th century together. Okay, so gay community becomes possible in the 20th century because of wage labor. When you can earn a wage, you don't have to live with your parents and your family. If you don't have to live with your family, you can act as you like. You have autonomy from the family, so now gay community develops. And many people sort of confirm this through different means, but the thing we don't say about that is, I'll repeat, capitalism and gay identity enter the 20th century together. And that's also a problem, because it means that part of the, there's a kind of spiral of power that exists between homosexuality and capital that we can never quite get clear of. And that means that we need a different language to talk about gay identity than the one that, say, George Chauncey gave us in Gay New York, where we just end up with a cityscape in which these brave gay men are doing their sex thing in all kinds of places against homophobia and all the forces railed against them. Yeah, kind of, but capitalism and gay identity are actually very dependent upon each other. and capitalism and gay identity turn out to be very, very compatible. And so we have pink dollars, and we have gay investments, and so on. And I think my next slide, yes, is the correct one. This film was made in 1993, a film that very, very few people saw. It is a film about gentrification made by Linda Good Bryant, who was the gallerist of a famous gallery that roved around New York City called Just Above Midtown. And just above Midtown was a gallery for artists of color, because artists of color were never shown in the main museums. So Linda Good Bryant, that's what she did in the 70s. By the 90s, she'd moved from art history to thinking about gentrification, which is the right move, by the way. These things are working in tandem. And she made a film called Flag Wars, in which she told the story of a group of gay and lesbian realtors in Ohio who saw an opportunity for good investment in a neighborhood that was full of Black renters. So remember, the narrative is splitting. The Black family is removed. The split is the monument remembering the voided community. In Flag Wars, they tell this absolutely heart-wrenching story in which Black community, I'm not going to even say families, people who have been living in this neighborhood forever as renters are one by one picked off and moved out by not just gay and lesbian realtors, but gay and lesbian realtors selling to gays and lesbians, white gays and lesbians who move in, and by the end of 5 years, that neighborhood is cleared. That film went nowhere in LGBT film festivals, but it's the film of that decade, because it's telling us to be more careful about the way that we think about lesbian and gay history. Lesbian and gay history is not only about homophobia and oppression, it is also about the collusion with capital. The person that I take, okay, this is my fancy graphic, prepare yourself, there you go. I take this term, deflationary queer history, from the late theorist Christopher Chitty, a graduate student who wrote an incredible dissertation at the University of California, Santa Cruz, called Sexual Hegemony. And I'll just be brief in the interest of time, tell you to go read that book. It was published by one of his friends and another professor after he died by killing himself after he had written this incredible dissertation. And what the dissertation says is, sodomy has always been an axis for hegemony. At certain moments in history, the state encourages sodomy. At other times, it condemns it, and it depends what's needed. So for example, in 15th century Florence, the state encouraged sodomy. It only fined you if you were caught. It did not kill you, okay? Rome at the same time killed you if you were engaged in sodomy, and its fortunes and its economy went down. Florence was the most successful city in that period, and it was collecting huge fines from sodomites. But more importantly, it was managing groups of young men, rebellious men, by blackmailing them, and those men were blackmailing the older, wealthy men that they were having sex with, and getting secrets from the older men and handing them over to the state. And that circuit, says Chitty, is a better way of thinking about homosexuality. Gay men are constantly embedded in circuits of power and knowledge across this early modernity into capitalism, all the way up to gay pride parades and, as we'll find out, Philip Johnson. So if we have a concept of sexual hegemony, we're in a deflationary queer history. There's no gay New York. We're in a gay history that is aware of the fact that even as some people are being hounded out of their jobs as school teachers, other gay men are colluding with the state. I give you Exhibit A, Roy Cohn. And you could say, well, he's just one bad apple. He's just this one guy. Roy Cohn was a lawyer who prosecuted people in the McCarthy era. He was a gay man. He went after gay teachers. He was the guy who made sure that Ethel Rosenberg was executed on charges of selling secrets to the Soviets during the war. Selling secrets to the Soviets during the war. During the war, Russia was a US ally, by the way. So when we think about the Rosenbergs, we should think about the way in which the US cut its ties with socialism, but did not cut its ties with Nazism, and that's why we are where we are today. And Roy Cohn was Donald Trump's mentor. And he showed Trump how to get out of paying taxes early on that allowed Trump to have multiple investments in New York City. So some version of New York City has been built by white gay men. And I'm going to give you another example. Andy Warhol. Wow, Roy Cohn was Andy Warhol's lawyer. That's insane to me that Roy Cohn was Andy Warhol's lawyer. So Andy Warhol not only was Roy Cohn his lawyer, but he tried to sell Trump a silkscreen of Trump Towers in the 1980s, and it was even too ugly for Trump to buy. Trump was like, yeah, I'm not going to buy that. And Andy was super disappointed after spending so much time trying to get a commission from Trump. What's Warhol's goal in the 70s and 80s? Money, money, money. Okay? So I have questions about Warhol and his position in art history. We can go on and on about how he was beset by homophobia in a homophobic art world. He was not. He was out as a gay man his entire career. He never passed as a straight guy, and he made massive contributions to the development of the art market at that time. There are other anarchist currents at that time, like Sylvia Rivera, who pushed her way onto the stage of the 1973 Christopher Day Parade to deliver a message to white gays and lesbians. So this split that I'm narrating, I'm not forcing it on the history, it's there. It was there in 73 when Sylvia Rivera got on the stage to say to the gay and lesbian people who did not want her to speak, who were gathered there, she said, you people, you're part of a white middle-class club. She said the people, meaning the people in her group, the street transvestites action revolutionaries, are trying to do something for all of us, and not men and women that belong to a white middle-class club. That's what you all belong to. That split was deeply felt at that moment, but we've refused that deflationary history and told a different story that smooths all the edges out. Thanks in part to books like Gay New York, I would say. Okay, if you have a deflationary gay history, then you'll need an aesthetics to go with it. And my aesthetics is rooted in the work of this photographer, Alvin Baltrop. Baltrop made the best photographs of the cuts that Matt Clark made on the West Side piers. This is Day's End, that the movie is made about. And he was there mostly to take images of gay men cruising. But along the way, his camera ended up seeking out the collapsing piers. And we do see gay men cruising. But look at the scale of this image. If you tell me that this is a photograph about gay men cruising, I'm going to laugh, because the scale tells me that if it's about anything, maybe it's about Day's End, or maybe it's about the warehouse itself and it's collapsing. But to say because there are a few bodies scattered across the piers that it's about that is ludicrous to me. And I'll just show you some of the other images to give you a context for his work. This is a very typical Baltrop photograph, but his work has been cast as simply part of the artwork of that time that was committed to representing cruising gay men. And I would call this the false logic of the charisma of sex. That if there's anything to do with sex in the frame, we think that's what the image is about. When in fact, there are so many ways to read these images by a Black gay photographer. They're about dereliction, they're about dispossession, they're about the city, they're about collapse, they're about decay. And they do offer a kind of erotics of this very queer zone, but it's an erotics that is different from this one. This is the image that thrilled in the 80s and 90s, was the Mapplethorpe tidy interiors that became so, censored on the one hand and collected on the other. Censorship does wonders for your sales, by the way. Baltrop was not censored because he was never shown. He was never shown in a gallery in his lifetime. And these images today, sell for millions and continue to be the images of a rebellious order of gay men who were doing what? Having sex. Okay, what else? You want to remember Sylvia Rivera. What else was going on other than you were in the piers having sex? What politics is that connected to? A deflationary queer history. And that's what Baltrop gives us. These are images, by the way, of detumescence, collapse, falling down, and they are to be read, offering us images of gay sex. That's called blowjob, and there is a blowjob in there if you look really carefully, and that's awesome. But you have to look through the collapsing building to get to the blowjob, suggesting that there's a different orientation around masculinity, the body, the phallus. We're not just with the upright skyscrapers, we're also with the detumescent rafters that have fallen and are going to continue to fall, okay? And it's a beautiful, beautiful image, and you could say that the eros of it is intensified by the collapsed masonry around it. But we prefer this. This is the art market. Jeff Koons, ever erect, pert little puppy that sits happily outside of every bloody museum saying, money, money, money. That's what capital looks like. And therefore, the aesthetic of collapse is an anti-capitalist aesthetic connecting to a different politics within which lots of gay men play a role, lots of gay men of color play a role, but it's a different narrative than the one we've told about capitalism and gay identity. All right, there are lots of girl films about the piers too. I'm just going to mention that one to say this is not just about men duking it out in the piers. This is one of the few films ever shot in the piers, and again, it was not censored at the time it was made, and therefore no one remembers it, and almost no one has seen this film. Anyone in this room seen this film? I rest my case. It was made by the guy who made Saturday Night Fever on a big budget. It's not a tiny art house film, but you've never seen it. And you've never seen it because nobody protested it and said, we don't want this film made. In the same year, they protested Cruising with Al Pacino, and that film is a regular on the film circuit. Just saying. All right. Let me tell you my story about Philip Johnson, and then I will just conclude with one image from my trans archive of collapsing and deflationary and anarchitectural work. So the reason Johnson is of interest to me is simply because there's a meeting. At a certain moment, there's a meeting between Matta Clark and Philip Johnson. And the meeting, while it's sort of an inconsequential, monumental type of meeting, it's redolent with symbolic imagery about the difference between fascism and anarchism in relationship to the built environment. So I'm going to get there. But what you may know about Philip Johnson is the Glass House, and you probably know that he was involved with MoMA. But what you don't know necessarily, because people didn't seem to know until a biography came out a few years ago by Mark Lamster, is that he was actively in the 1930s, not just a fascist, he was a Nazi. So Johnson, and people keep saying to me, but if you didn't know that about him, wouldn't you love his architecture? No, and I do. I don't know what else to say. I do know that about him, and I do find that there are fascist elements to his architecture. So how did this happen? Philip Johnson was a fabulously wealthy man anyway. He went to Harvard, which is what fabulously wealthy people do. And at Harvard, he met a guy, Alfred Barr, who said, I'm going to start a museum of modern art in New York City. Johnson's like, that's cool. He's like, do you want to be the architecture department director? Johnson's like, I'm not an architect. That's okay. So off they go. He's not an architect. He's not trained as an architect. Didn't know anything about architecture. He's been studying ancient Greek, for God's sake. He now puts on a show, the international style, and that becomes the logic for the next, 20, 30 years of urban architecture. And just as this is happening, Mies van der Rohe conveniently comes to the US with Johnson's help, not because he's fleeing the Nazis, but because he wasn't getting good work in Germany at the time, as one of his biographers explained. So he comes to the US and builds a little apartment for Johnson in the city. And Johnson is sort of set, right? So then he goes on an art tour in, oh, and by the way, his dad leaves him a bunch of stocks in aluminium. And that was sort of a rebuke for being gay. His dad's like, well, I'll give you something, but just these aluminium stocks. But then the war's buildup begins, and those stocks go through the roof because they're used to build weapons. So he is now already winning from the war, okay? So he goes to collect modern art, paying very little money to very, very amazing artists in Europe, ships his car to Europe to do so. It's this kind of guy. And buys up all this artwork, comes back. That work is still in the MoMA, by the way. But while in Germany, what does he see? He sees a parade, a Nazi youth parade, and writes to a friend that he is absolutely enamored with the blonde boys in their uniforms, and he thinks Hitler is really doing something special. And it would be better for the country than the leadership that we have. Then he comes home and writes not one, but 2 reviews of Mein Kampf. I mean, no one reviewed Mein Kampf. It's not like a literary masterpiece that people are like, let me think about this book for a while, right? He reviews it twice, leaves MoMA, and starts an American fascist party. So this is not the kind of biographical detail where you're like, you know, he made a mistake, right? He starts an American fascist party and styles himself as its Führer, okay? And so it goes. Finally, in 1939, just to cap it all off, he is invited to march into Poland with the Wehrmacht at the explicit invitation of Hitler himself, and goes. And he always remembers the stirring spectacle, he says, that he saw that night when they marched into Poland, that he then introduces to his glass house in the form of the brick chimney, which when it's, the only solid thing in that house is the brick chimney, almost a crematoria in the middle of the chimney. Some people would stay. And when it's lit at night with no other lights on, he said it recreated for me the stirring spectacle of seeing the Jewish shtetls burning in Poland. Wow, right? Okay, so I'm not going to ignore this history when I'm reading that house, nor did Mark Lamster, his biography, nor does Mitch McEwen and a whole bunch of architectural theorists who are interested in this conundrum. So that's Philip Johnson. Here's his Mies van der Rohe collab, the Seagram Tower, which eliminated an entire residential neighborhood on Park Avenue in order for that to be built. And its footstep was so big, the way around there were certain problems with building it, so they had to put a plaza so regular people could walk around there. And the footprint was so big that it pushed half of the neighborhood out of the area altogether. Just one final anecdote, and I know I'm running out of time, but Johnson designed the Four Seasons restaurant in the ground floor of the hotel. And originally, he commissioned Mark Rothko to make 13 paintings for the Four Seasons. And I went to see the Rothko show in Paris last year, and those paintings were not there. And they were like, or they were, no, I think they were not there. And they were like, and of course there were the Seagram building paintings that he never gave to the Seagram building. I'm like, well, why didn't Rothko give the paintings to the Seagram building? Rothko came and visited the Seagram building, went and dined in the Four Seasons restaurant. He said, this is the most disgusting place I have ever been in my life. This is just an absolute temple to wealthy people and capital. I will not give you my paintings. And he reneged on the deal. And on the day before he killed himself, he sent every one of those paintings to the Tate in the UK, and they arrived after his death. That's an incredible rebuke, okay? He also said, I guess art doesn't change anything. I couldn't put my paintings in and change this atrium. But I think that Matt Clark thought differently. So let me give you, of course, there he is at the glass house. I just have questions. Why did all these gay men go to the glass house after the war? why, like, we know who this guy is. We know what he did. He was investigated by the FBI, spent not a day in prison, right? Whereas if you were a Black Panther, just 10 years later, you were jailed, imprisoned, tortured, assassinated. That guy spent not one day, and within a decade, half of these gay male modernist painters were out at the Glass House. Jasper Johns, Rauschenberg, he dated John Cage for a while. I have questions. I just have questions. Okay. So let's move on to the meeting. So, and I found this out accidentally when I was listening to a lecture by Matta Clark's widow, Jane Crawford. So 1976, Matta Clark is invited by Peter Eisenman to come and do a piece for this fancy architectural institute in Midtown Manhattan. He comes with his photographs of blown out Bronx windows. And he wants to bring the dereliction of the Bronx to Midtown. So he hangs the photographs, and then he says to Eisenman, do you mind if I shoot out one of these windows? And Eisenman's like, yeah, I do actually, don't do it. So he comes back a few hours later with a BB gun and he shoots all the windows out. Matta Clark does. Comes back the next day with Jane, his wife, and is handed a brown paper bag with all the photographs, and he's told that he's not going to show in this exhibit anymore. And every single one of those windows has been repaired. And Jane is astounded that in New York City in 1976, you could get windows fixed overnight. And she's like, well, who fixed the windows? Philip Johnson, president of the Institute. Okay, this is not a real meeting, but I want you to consider that what the anarchist breaks and splits and calls attention to as broken, the fascist fixes. And that logic of repair is what I caution against, okay? I want us to think together about the problem with the reparative. Eisenman, for his part, and I'm going to just say this because Eisenman remains a kind of revered figure for his monument to the murdered Jews of Europe, if nothing else, Eisenman, for his part, accused Matta Clark of creating another Kristallnacht. And then went on to write the introduction to Philip Johnson's collected writings, in which he said that the Glass House was an anti-war monument to the purity of the human spirit. Right. So Eisenman is a douche in many ways, and Eisenman later in life, like Johnson, who to his dying day was singing the praises of Albert Speer. I'm not even sure the Nazis thought Albert Speer was such a great architect, but Johnson did, and so did Eisenman. And Eisenman is the one who says, you know, it doesn't exactly matter what somebody's politics are. If I look at an Albert Speer building, I still think this is amazing. Eisenman says this. So I really want to contest that and absolutely insist upon some kind of biographical detail in the stories that we tell in order to make sense of the politics of the symbolic gestures. All right, no more heroes. I leave you then just with one of my favorite, I can't call Jesse Darling a trans artist, but he said I could say that I can't call him a trans artist because he does not like to be collected under that label. All well and good. Jesse Darling does not like to be called a trans artist. That gives you the information you need. And this was one of his pieces, its own kind of monument to collapse and dereliction. It's called Gravity's Road. It's crafted or named for one of the first roller coasters ever made. And as you can see, this is a roller coaster you could never ride, that is about precarity and fragility and the danger that the body faces in the built environment. It's also situated, it was installed in a gallery that had been used by the Third Reich to house a swimming pool. And that detail seems really important and interesting to me. And it's hard to see it from the architecture because there's a balcony now around the edge, but what we're actually in is sitting in the pool. And the pool was there, of course, as a kind of a place for the body to become beautiful and the whole Freikorps thing. And Jesse Darling wants this to be a kind of reminder of the impending frailty of every body, and the way in which we can get a kind of childish joy out of looking at this loopy roller coaster, but it also is literally a structure that will not hold the human in place. So I'm going to just end with that and just say I hope that you'll take this in the spirit of a kind of polemic, and I'm open to any and all questions, and I'm really looking forward to engaging with Damon.
Thank you, Jack. I want to reiterate the thanks to Sophie and also to Niklaus, Carolina, and Christian for organizing this really awesome event. We've had a lot of great conversations at the workshop. We learned a lot from everybody there, and thanks for inviting us to participate. So I'm going to kind of riff on some of the conceptual underpinnings of Jack's talk and draw out some of the conceptual strands about the concept of unworlding that we've taught a number of seminars about, and the refusal of the reparative where Jack ended up. And I'm going to then think about the project of aesthetics, queer aesthetics, but in relationship to cinema, which is what I work on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the new queer cinema and about queer cinema as its own aesthetic project of unworlding, with an architectural theme given the context. For the past few years, every summer, Jack and I, with our colleague Tavia Nyong'o, have taught a summer workshop on queer and trans theory with a non-affirmative and negative bent. We have called these workshops on unworlding and focused, for example, on architectures of collapse that Jack spoke about, on worlds that are untenable, that strain against their contradictions, and on discourses of life that are in fact deathly, like any pro-life discourse in the United States that is always conjoined, as Lee Edelman has shown, to the denial of healthcare to adults. On atmospheres that sustain life but also prove toxic, on discourses of the reparative that prove to be deeply paranoid, and especially on discourses of universal rights that are in fact premised on Black death and on maintaining while disavowing a regime of anti-Blackness. So these contradictions interest us. And I would say Jack and I tend to share a certain skepticism about anything that claims to be world building, because usually worlds are built on a foundation that covers over unmarked graves. Or to adapt the famous epigram of Walter Benjamin, there is no architecture of civilization which is not at the same time an architecture of barbarism. Tavia, our comrade and collaborator, has held up against what I would call our Jewish pessimism the case for utopia, while reminding us that utopia is, of course, defined precisely by the fact that it doesn't and cannot exist. Our skepticism is driven by a shared sense that discourses of life often cover over practices of death dealing. Consider in the United States, not the current fascist regimes, but the Democratic Party's relentless funding of a genocide live streamed in Gaza while disingenuously promoting an electoral platform of joy, affect instead of action or policies, thus undertaking a project of extermination which has proved continuous between regimes from the allegedly liberal to the overtly fascist. Queer theory has always been skeptical of a liberalism whose milquetoast discourses of rights and the rule of law are openly contradicted by its own legacies of slavery and empire, its ongoing practices of surveillance and control, of extrajudicial killing, of prohibited speech it calls free, and indeed now of genocide. Unworlding then is also a name for revolution, for the vital energies of destruction, if you can hold that paradox, that have nurtured countless projects of aesthetic revolt. Consider, for example, the film Baise-moi. I work on French cinema, so by Virginie Despentes and Coralie Trenti, in which a kind of pure feminist rage, which is world-making and world-destroying, is expressed in the form of a cinematic orgy of violence, a killing spree. I take this aesthetic violence to be a life-affirming answer to the real regimes of governmentality and the slow and fast death they deal in. In the realm of aesthetics, we can imagine the end of the world on different terms than the ones in which the world really appears to be ending. Or consider the earlier feminist classic Born in Flames, which we talked about this morning, from 1982 or 3. As Jana Brown writes in her discussion of the film's politics of refusal, and I want you to hear the negative tenor of this quote, Lizzie Borden's film invites us to rejuvenate a vision of non-compliance that dances and screams and blows things up, that refuses and disrupts rather than appeals. What it ultimately asks us to understand is that revolutionary change is not a destination, but practice. This practice is based in a continual questioning and requires that we defy and destabilize dominant paradigms, and then that we sit in the ambiguity of not knowing what might be. So there's a lot of nots in that statement, which I want to highlight. Defiance, destabilizing dominant paradigms, sitting in ambiguity, assuming the position of not knowing. These are gestures of critical theory, critical acts of negation that have energized the project of queer theory and queer aesthetics that Jack and I both work in and that many people here are contributing to. And I think it's important to reiterate something Jack also said, that queerness conceived as a theoretical project in this way is not about affirmation of an identity. Jessie Darling is right to say they are not a trans artist. Not about saying, I recognize myself as X, asexual, demisexual, whatever. My students now have a range of categories. So it's precisely not a project of recognition, but of critically negating the flimsy premises of normativity, saying no to what appears to be inevitable, which means the unmaking of what takes shape, the deforming of what congeals as the given forms of the world. Thus, Jack finds in his talk an ally in the Anarchitect who, to quote the talk, sets out to unbuild the structures, the imaginaries, and the systems that prop up relations between form and function, that sustain certain forms over others, and that elevate the house from a living space to a unit of capital. That elevation of the living space into an abstract unit of capital, of so-called real estate, goes hand in hand with the deprivation of life to those who would live but cannot access capital. The Anarchitect interrupts this process of elevation, instead creating an architecture of collapse and entropy, voiding the transmutation of a real space for living into an abstract unit of value. His work, their work, depends on the literal cut, as we saw in Splitting, conceived as a hunting for emptiness, as Gordon Matta Clark put it, in response to a landscape of neglect. As Jack pointed out, Gordon Matta Clark died in 1978 at just 35 years old. Working in and on the Manhattan piers in the 1970s, he confronted an architecture of precarity at the heart of the geography of global capital. Right after his death, the landscape of death also began to shift. And in the written version, Jack talks about how in the 1970s, the precarity was economic, but in the 1980s, the bodies on the piers began to succumb to a different form of debilitating illness, which obviously AIDS. So for the next 10 minutes or so, or few minutes, I want to briefly extend the line of thought about Anarchitecture and this apparatus of unworlding I've been discussing by talking about a cinema movement that emerged on the other side of the AIDS crisis in the early 1990s called the New Queer Cinema, something I'm about to begin a project on, that was fueled by the activist rage that took shape in response to the AIDS crisis in aesthetic political movements such as ACT UP and Grand Fury, with its die-ins and interventions in public space, and by the intellectual energies of deconstruction and queer theory fermenting in the Anglo-American Academy with the publication of such works as Judith Butler's Gender Trouble in 1990. Filmmakers such as Marlon Riggs, Derek Jarman, Isaac Julian, Greg Araki, Cheryl Danier, and others produced new cinematic languages of queerness, but not in the name of claiming an identity, which had been a kind of earlier project of conformist 70s gay politics, but in the name of unmaking standard modes of narrative and documentary. From the perspective of architecture, I want to briefly look at just two films that emerge from this movement, films that I'm interested in because they affirm nothing, but that instead map the void, and they map a process of unworlding. Todd Haynes' masterpiece, Safe, his best film from 1996, is set in Southern California and suburbia in 1987, the year President Reagan finally acknowledged the existence of the AIDS epidemic after tens of thousands of deaths in the US alone. And at the same year, the US closed its borders to HIV-positive travelers and immigrants, a kind of earlier version of Build the Wall, showing that both queers and migrants are kind of at the heart of what's imagined to threaten the nation state, which Klaus Teweleit already showed in his earlier study, Fascism in Male Fantasies. So this historical context of 1987 creates a silent background to the film which mentions nothing directly about AIDS or homosexuality. It is instead a film in which dwelling spaces from the protagonist Carol's perfectly designed but lifeless mansion to the igloo-like isolation chamber in which she ends function as various kinds of prisons. Like all architectures are prisons in this film, seeming to offer refuge from a toxic world, but in fact, contributing to that toxicity. What is killing Carol? The world itself. So the other film is probably one you have not seen. Safe is quite well known. This film is not so well known, but the filmmaker Gus Van Sant is. And his earlier films, Mala Noche from 85 and My Own Private Idaho from 91, were more direct antecedents of the new queer cinema movement. Whereas Safe offers a superabundance of architectural spaces, which I'll show you in a moment, Jerry stages their complete disappearance. It's set in a nameless desert, filmed between Death Valley, the Utah Salt Plains, and in Argentina, at an unmarked historical moment, identifiable only by the generic, the kind of 1990s fashion of its two twunky bros, Matt Damon and Casey Affleck. Those bros, both named Jerry in the film, which I love, function as a kind of everyman who inhabit a worldless and placeless expanse. So each of these two films, there are others that we could talk about, but let's talk about these two. They unmistakably come out of the new queer cinema movement, but neither film is explicitly queer. However, both interrupt heteronormativity by simply canceling it. In Safe, Carol abandons pretty quickly her life of heteronormativity that's organized through its architectural spaces, the house, the gym, the restaurant with her girlfriends, the department store, to become a recluse. In Jerry, heteronormativity and indeed heterosexuality of any kind are bracketed by the film that contains no heterosexual couple, neither in the narrative nor as a reference in dialogue. So the protagonists don't speak about any girlfriend or make reference to any object of sexual or romantic interest, which is very unusual for a film with Matt Damon. Within the terms of the film, their only relationship is with each other and mostly with the enormous landscape that dwarfs them. If there is any trajectory towards coupling in the film, it culminates only in the physical encounter between the two Jerrys after days lost in the desert in a complex embrace that evokes sex, but in which leads to the death of one Jerry. So that would be a perverse realization of the principle of the couple, sung by the Spice Girls around the same time, that two becomes one. With the removal of the narrative apparatus of heterosexual coupling, both Safe and Jerry in different ways also remove the entire world built around its normative force. In Jerry, this takes the literal form of the removal of all buildings. There's no building in the film. The only sign of human infrastructure is the road that connects places that we will never see in the film. The film erases any human-built environment that would organize the movement of bodies in spatialized hierarchies. This cancelled world is the nothing, into which the two everyman characters venture out in search of something they call only the thing. The thing they are looking for is introduced from the beginning in the mode of negation. It's just going to be a fucking thing at the end of the trail. Fuck the thing, they say to each other. So at the outset, the aim that grounds their journey through and into the nothing exists only as something negated, an aim they've already abandoned. Safe, by contrast, puts on view a proliferation of architectural spaces, some evoking mid-century modernism that you spoke about, or suburbia. So, and from the most austere to the most luxurious to the most austere are all built on a toxic foundation. Some interiors with domestic laborers. That's the house of the guy who owns the New Age retreat. Okay, we're getting to this. So there's no escape in Safe from the world, but that world has ceased to be hospitable to Carol. The aptly named Carol White, played by the amazing Julianne Moore, is imprisoned within the spaces of her affluent life, just as she's imprisoned within a heterosexual marriage that brings no joy, as we see early on in the film's only sex scene. Sex is a form of domestic labor in Safe and provides no horizon of emancipation. Indeed, whatever ails Carol, whatever she seeks, it is not a better form of sex. I think this also resonates with Jack's skepticism about sex as an imaginary revolutionary force. Kind of anti-Reichian here today. It's resonating with the surgeons. Somebody was speaking about Reich. It was the Essie, yeah. From the beginning, Carol is imprisoned within the interior spaces that shape the habitus of her aspirational social class, houses, restaurants, gyms. Moore is framed against these interiors as if caught in a still life, an incongruous human element in what the French more aptly call nature morte. These mortifying spaces are maintained through racialized labor performed by housekeepers, delivery men, janitors, cooks, usually non-white in the film, with the occasional hint of a suppressed eye roll, the only sign of dissent in an otherwise seamless and toxic system of disavowed exploitation. Far from guiltless, Carol is a cluelessly willing participant in this system, as I think we most are when we just live in the world, right? She orders the delivery men and her housekeeper around unthinkingly, condescendingly, attempting to speak Spanish. Fulvia, could I have some milk, some leche? The film registers without dwelling on the fact that what is toxic for Carol White is doubly so for those non-white others whose labor frees her to pursue her retreat from the world. I'm also thinking of a resonance with your paper, Sergio. The basement dwelling place of the housekeeper. The hairdresser applying the chemicals of a perm, the manicurist coating her nails, the handyman painting the cabinets, the housekeeper fetching the milk. These are all toxic substances. As the film progresses, Carol gets increasingly sick, symptoms resembling Kaposi sarcoma, the AIDS symptom, erupting on her body like uncanny signifiers of something awry, for which the doctors and psychiatrists, however, can find no cause. It isn't that Carol is mad exactly, it's that the world has ceased to house her. Her body rejects its emplacement within these spaces, and after discovering a self-help group that specializes in environmental illness, she seeks the solace of their residential retreat. This gets her away from her family life with its toxicity, but ends up being another kind of communitarian prison, one based around affirmations of love and goodwill, which ultimately conceal hostility and violence. And one of the things that's most brutal about this film is that there's just absolutely no answer. Like every solution she seeks proves to be just another form of violent disavowal. At Wrenwood, still disturbed by fumes and noises from a nearby highway, Carol eventually moves into the igloo-like dome structure that I showed you in the earlier slide. It's become an individual cell or coffin walled off from the world. The film ends with a stark shot of Carol repeating affirmations in the mirror. This is a moving shot, I think. No, I've got to do this. I love you. I really love you, she says to herself. She's looking at us, but we aren't there. She ends the film alone, encrypted, enunciating a self-love whose continuous reiteration betrays its empty, merely performative status. The removal of the world has left her in the space of pure affirmation that itself seems deathly. Safe advances the false solution of retreating from imprisonment in architectures of capitalist inequality and their toxic environments into hermetic self-enclosure. But if hell is other people, as Sartre famously wrote, the self is also a hell, or rather a dystopia, as we see in this closing shot where Carol has never looked more frail or on the point of disappearance. Safe borrows from melodrama its focus on the emotional life of a white female protagonist. To this extent, the drama of unworlding it unfolds is played out as Carol's drama, even if the problem the film diagnoses is precisely bigger than her or the structures that house her. It is as big as the world. Whereas Safe enters deeply into the subjectivity of its protagonist, immersed in her architected world, Jerry's narrative perspective remains completely outside the subjectivity of its protagonists, who it dwarfs, and this is also, there they are, down the bottom right, who it dwarfs against a vastness that evokes what Heidegger calls the nothing. And here I'm also coming back to Jack's mention of Heidegger and the question of metaphysics, which I'm going to end with. Our relationship to which, argues Heidegger, defines human existence as such. In Jerry, the camera frequently leaves its protagonist behind entirely, panning to find a world that in its very vastness recedes. So it's also kind of unworlding. It recedes because it's ungraspable. It can never be inframed fully, as the panning motion shows. There's always something more. And because also it exceeds human intentions. The men's attempts at orienting themselves quickly fall into absurdity. Let's meet at the spot. I was waiting for you at the spot. That wasn't the spot. Fuck the spot. Ultimately, as the days of their wandering through the desert proceed, it becomes clear that like the road that seems to come and go nowhere, there is no destination other than nothingness itself. In What is Metaphysics, Heidegger writes that Dasein means being held out into the nothing. Jerry stages this holding out into the nothing in the mode of an allegory of nothing. Its removal of architecture reveals this existential fact, just as it confirms that human beings cannot persist without spaces for dwelling. We are creatures that use language and tools to build structures and worlds, but where language is always a prison house and where those worlds kill us. To return to Jack's talk, finally, Gordon Matter Clark's work reveals that every architecture contains an anarchitecture, a latent cut or a hungering for emptiness that undoes it from within, an invisible momentum of entropy. As an adjacent form of aesthetic practice, cinema here reveals its queer potentiality as a technology not only of projecting worlds, but of unworlding. And I'm ending here on a slide from a film referenced by Jerry in its opening sequence and its closing credits, which also brings the AIDS reference to the fore. Derek Jarman's Blue, a film with no image at all, made when he had lost his eyesight to AIDS-related illness, and in which the world has completely receded as a visual image. Only because the nothing is manifest in the ground of Dasein can this total strangeness of beings waft over us, wrote Heidegger. Nur weil das Nichts im Grunde des Daseins offenbar ist, kann die totale Fremdheit des Seienden uns anwehen. This Fremdheit is not just the static otherness of the world, but its perpetual unworlding that unsettles us at our root, destroying all foundations, which means that what queer theory or anarchitecture do for political or aesthetic reasons also has an existential basis, albeit one that's certainly better than Heidegger's politics, since Heidegger was also a Nazi. A smart one. Cinema as a spatial medium here reveals its queer affinity for imagining the suicidal reduction or expansion of space, for imagining worldly erasure in the mode of an elaborately constructed aesthetic spectacle. So here, as with Gordon Matter Clark, aesthetic practice is a response to a deathly world, a world that turns living spaces into units of capital, and in which the apparent abstraction of capital veils and authorizes the material destruction of its and our environmental foundation. Instead of affirming a world in response to this inexorable deathliness, these queer works and Jack's whole project instead crystallize it in aesthetic forms that project, as Jack said, entropy, collapse, withdrawal, erasure. In so doing, each work poses the existential question, why is there something rather than nothing? And by extension, each therefore suggests the further, still crucial question, the question of all art and politics. What else could we imagine? Thank you. I guess we should stay. We only have one minute.
Awesome.
Yeah, sorry about
Yeah.
that. We'll grab a chair if you want.
Yeah, grab a chair, Sergio.
Wow, thank you both so much for those two incredible lectures. There's really, they're both so sweet, and I'm not quite sure where to start. I think I'm going to go through processing these two talks for a while. And I guess maybe as an open question, I'm curious about if there's a midpoint between maybe these proposals of aesthetics. When I think of aesthetics, I think there's kind of like soft compulsion maybe of beauty. I think like of maybe like Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. His second and third chapters are about, the second chapter is like why did all of the black men I grew up with in Martinique prefer white women. The third chapter is why do all the black women I grew up with in Martinique prefer white men. Right? Asking, I think, this really essential question about how colonialism changes already our desires, our wants, what we find compelling, what we find beautiful, what we're drawn to. And so I think, I'm like in that vein, maybe I'm curious. I think it was in the talk, but I'm so overwhelmed that I'm maybe having trouble teasing it apart. Like, what is the aesthetic compulsion? Is it still beauty in this in architecture? Like, is there a thing that we're being drawn to, or is there something about the act of opening up, the act of taking apart that is the desirable act? Or am I still thinking about this incorrectly? Am I still thinking about wanting, desiring, when the project is something else? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, Damon, this could come back to you as well in terms of these empty aesthetics that both of those films operate with. And I was trying to remember what the desert was in Safe that she retreats to in Renwood.
Yeah, so it's like somewhere.
It's maybe in New Mexico?
Yeah, she drives there.
Yeah. So there's something about this emptiness. And I think Sergio's question about whether we're in the presence of an aesthetic oriented towards beauty, or whether we're being asked to reorient away from beauty and towards other forms of aesthetic pleasure, is a good one. I don't completely have an answer. I have thought about it because sometimes when I'm talking about Matt Clark's work, I'll say, and then this cut is so beautiful, and then someone will say, but is that what it is? Because it didn't seem like that's what you were saying, you know? So the best way I have to think about that is thinking with James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State. Do people know that book? James C. Scott is an anarchist anthropologist, and he explains in Seeing Like a State that we are not just governed by the systems that we inhabit, but those systems, exactly as Sergio said, redirect our desire. And the example that he gives is kind of architectural and urban. He says, under National Socialism and under certain other forms of fascism, there was a desire to have these like massive buildings in the city on the one hand, and then these straight line sort of boulevards and streets so that everything led to the center. And he said, we really think of that as a kind of urban beauty, the order of the city. But as Richard Sennett, another urban theorist, reminds us, cities thrive in their disorder, you know, and you can think about cities that were at odds with colonialism, like Algiers, where I can't remember if it was Le Corbusier or somebody was like, oh my God, this city is so disorderly, we need to bring this kind of symmetry to the landscape. And of course, cities don't thrive on symmetry. Like a city that is orderly is also a city that has very little life. And I think that these cuts and this introduction of vacancy and this messy urban landscape that Matt Clark was trying to contribute to rather than clean up does imply a different value for the aesthetic, and one that might be connected. And who was it who said that? In fact, it was Claire who said that today, that maybe the unruliness of desire, the unruliness of certain forms of art can then be mapped onto the unruliness of certain forms of desire that we want to clean up with these categories and then mete out, parcel out, say this is gay art, this is not gay art, and so on.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great answer. Now I think the question, actually wasn't thinking about beauty at all, because I was thinking about aesthetics as a practice, like as something that, as a way of acting on a violent world that's different from actually taking up arms or just being completely passive. So, but obviously aesthetics in its history is about beauty, as you said. And as I was looking at your slides, we've got Matt Clark, those works are beautiful.
They are, actually.
Really, yes.
Yeah, which is confusing.
It's confusing, but I think it's interesting. Either we can reclaim beauty, but I think, obviously it's not beautiful in the sense of like the harmonious play of faculties. Maybe the desert in Jerry is more evoking the sublime, like the ungraspability of something that exceeds representation. But I'm also thinking of my colleague at Berkeley, Rizvana Bradley, has written a book recently about aesthetics. The very idea of aesthetics, what appears in the field of visibility as beautiful, is premised on a prior negation of blackness for Rizvana. So there's some violence that comes anti to the appearance of the aesthetic. This is a very complex theoretical argument, but in a way, like aesthetics already presupposes a violence that's kind of enabled it to appear as such. And I think we have to hold that troubling sense of violence within any claim of beauty, or even any claim about what aesthetics would be. Nevertheless, I don't have a better word for the kind of practice that these people are engaged in.
And maybe just one quick wonky question before we move on to the general questions. But Jack, do you have a reading of the brick house? And the glass house shares a property with an entirely brick opaque house. Can you share?
So this is in the New York Times. This is how commonly known now this biography of Philip Johnson is. And that's why it's so weird that Philip Johnson's name is still all over the MoMA, But there was a piece in the New York Times recently about the restoration of another property on the glass house compound, and that's a brick house. And the brick house was known as the house that was used to have sex in. So they, the aesthetic house, the architectural masterpiece is the glass house. But all those gay guys were there to do something, and that was happening in the brick house. They need
privacy for something.
Yeah, which is all sort of, if you go and see it, it's got sort of, fluffy pillows, and it's like much softer. And I mean, you're looking at the glass house like, dude, where did you even sit? It's like perched on a ladder or something, and everything is just stylized. It doesn't feel like you could sleep there or eat there or anything. But the brick house, that's what that's for. Where you close the bathroom door and you have this little cocoon-like area. And it's interesting that story's never been told. Like what were these sex parties? Why did he need a whole brick house for his sex parties, given that we know the clientele that was coming, the community that were coming to the place? The other piece on the land is a bunker. It's a bunker. And it's a bunker that Mitch McEwen suggests looks a little bit like the crematoria at Auschwitz. And you go into this bunker, and in that bunker are the most amazing paintings of Jewish shtetls by Frank Stella. And I'm just like, Frank Stella, what were you thinking? You know, number one. But number two, this is such a sneaky way of coming back to the Jewish shtetl again for Philip Johnson, right? And they're some of the best paintings that Frank Stella ever did. And there they are in Philip Johnson's bunker. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
There's also one Andy Warhol in there.
Do we just like not believe in sex anymore? I was like, as I was just that response, and I was listening to you talking about like the limitations of a kind of an idea of sex radicalism. But I mean, in fairness, like queer politics has been fueled by a sense that deviant sex is radical in its distance from normativity, right? And there was a time, I mean, even in the projects that were presented today about these kind of non-normative family arrangements, there's a destabilizing force to sexuality that moves outside of the nuclear family structure that's mapped in the architecture. I'm just thinking though, like, my first book's about sex and sex in public. Well, it's already kind of a critique, but now I'm writing about world erasure. I'm like, is sex just lost as a horizon of political imagination? It's a real question, I guess, for everybody.
I mean, for me, it is. I'd love to hear Sergio's thoughts, given the presentation that he gave. For me, I've always been persuaded by Foucault, always, that saying yes to sex does not mean saying no to power.
Right.
And that claiming sex as the most radical thing that you're doing because the state hates it or something is to the speaker's benefit. It gives you a sense of insurgency, and yet at the same time, like any sex thing you're doing, dude, some straight guy is doing a version of it somewhere else, and usually paying for it or whatever. Like sex is not the avenue necessarily to a kind of radical way of life. I mean, those folks you were talking about, HD and Breyer and Kenneth McPherson, I mean, they were in a very unusual sexual arrangement, but they had their maid downstairs. I mean, it was predicated upon the help being in the basement. So I think there is a limit to the claims we want to make about the kind of sex we have. It's just that we have to push back on the sex negativity people and the sex morality people.
Right.
But we don't want to push back on sex negativity by having a kind of philosexual discourse that says every time somebody's having sex in public, it's great. I mean, my neighbor just texted me and said there's some scaffolding gone up next door, and there are guys in there having sex and exposing themselves when kids are walking by. I just want you to be aware. Now, normally my alarm would go off and I'm like, oh, now we're going to report the pedophile in the neighborhood or something. But at the same time, there are public sex acts that are not great for everyone. They're just an annoyance. I don't want to see that, So I think we have to find some way to combat sex negativity and sex morality without falling into the other trap.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah.
I'm curious, because the way it relates to architecture, I think, is also super interesting, like the way sex structures architectural design.
Yeah, I mean,
And about the brick house. You were maybe thinking about the brick house.
Well, I was thinking about Mitch's, I think, reading of it. So I think I'm just going to maybe say a colleague of mine, friend Janos, is working on trans and queer love. And I think maybe you brought up the quote earlier by Foucault, like the thing that's threatening about isn't gay sex, but it's like
a way of
friendship,
life.
right? It's
Friendship.
It's like these ways in which queerness represents the opportunity to have relationships that are ungoverned, ungovernable, that are unscripted, that we make up on the fly.
Yeah.
So to me, it seems like, especially I think with these formulations of homosexuality, transness, lesbianism, that are all based on like sexualized qualities, I do think that there's something radical about ignoring that or maybe canceling those as like avenues through which to understand oneself, and to say instead that the communities of our own fashioning families of our own making, like love affairs of our own, of our own choosing. I think that as the kind of, that seems like it's on the edge of something really kind of important and powerful.
Yeah.
Which is not to abandon sex, but maybe we'll circle back to it. And yeah, Claire.
Well, absolutely amazing papers. And one thing that really struck me in both of them was this kind of grappling with this idea of the kind of fascistic being the sterile, the classifying, the colonializing, which is of course deeply rooted in systems of classification, the capitalist. And that, you know, I mean, you really kind of put your finger on everything I hate about Jeff Koons. That's great. But it really struck me that the opposite of that, and this came out through what you were saying, it feels like the opposite of that isn't sex necessarily, it's care. And in the Matter Clark gesture, you can see that kind of, there's a care in that for the people who've been displaced, there's a care in that for the fractures that are being created. It's not necessarily an act of care, but it's feeling that this matters, that this is worth reacting to, but the act of unmaking can itself be an act of care. And that just struck me really profoundly, and I felt it came out very strongly in both of those papers. I'm not sure if there's a question there, but
Yeah,
I'm
no,
really
that's
interested
fine.
in your response.
Yeah,
it's not an answer to that, because I think we're always getting a bit anxious about care because it too quickly tips over into the reparative care. I mean, but I'm quite convinced by what you're saying. Yeah, and I also was noticing in the Gordon Matter Clark work, it's an amazing amount of care in the work itself. Like there's a care for the world that it's responding to, and there's a care in the actual implementation of the cut or whatever. But I was thinking also, like, part of what's interesting about Matter Clark is that it's like anti-commercial, right? Like you can't monetize that as an art object on the market. It's the anti-Jeff Koons. Let me think more about care. I'll see what Jack has to say.
The anti-commercial is really important because at one point, one of the people who interviewed Matter Clark said, but don't you want to like leave a little piece and then like the Hirshhorn could take that piece and then that could be like in the museum? And Matter Clark is like, no, I don't want to leave a little piece for the museum. If the Hirshhorn is interested in what I do, they should invite me to come and make a cut into the Hirshhorn. And he actually did that. The one time he was able to make a cut into a museum was in the Museum of Beaux-Arts in Santiago de Chile. And he went there and he cut into the basement, into the foundation of the museum. That's he did something similar in the Art Institute in Chicago, but it wasn't exactly that. So the non-commercial quality of this work is so important as a refusal to create a deliverable to capital, you know, and here's your piece to sell, you know. Like Damon, I know that care, it's doing a very particular kind of work, Claire, in that comment that's so helpful. But I'm going to substitute care for something like solidarity, because at one point, Matt Clark was so excited about an anarchist action in Milan where students had occupied a building that was slated for demolition, and it was going to then be turned into a commercial zone, and they wanted to hold on to this post-industrial building and do something else in it. And he wrote to them and he was sort of like, in solidarity, I want to come and join you in Milan, and I will make a cut into the building, in effect, like making it unfit for capital. And before he was able to do so, they repossessed the building. So it's not exactly care. Care makes it too fuzzy. These are urban politics in relationship to communities that are being dispossessed, in relation to areas that are derelict, that are not to be rescued and not to be repaired, but are to be lived in and with and alongside the people who have made life there, right? As opposed to the people who want to build a different life for us that will be commercial.
Thank you very much. This has been blowing my mind. It's more of a comment. You just mentioned the word solidarity, which is a political term, really. And for me, there's this kind of super interesting incongruity in Gordon Clark's work, because it is deeply political.
Right.
And that would imply that he's very interested in the archival work of his work, in the sort of documentation.
Yeah.
And he does not seem to have an interest in it.
Yeah, that said, there's a huge archive.
Yeah.
Did you want to say more about that?
No, it's
yeah.
Just more like can you unpack this a little more for us?
His widow, you know, and they were not together that long, so this was an incredible act that Jane Crawford performed of collecting everything. She held on to everything. And that means all the letters that he wrote, in which he's saying things like, wouldn't the city skyline be great without skyscrapers? You know, it's like, wouldn't the city be great without the city? Wouldn't this housing complex be great without the housing? This kind of thing. Anyway, every letter, every tape made of every performance, every photograph, every document, every postcard. And then after he died, she started getting documents from the IRS, from the tax service, saying, Matta Clark owes money on these plots of land that he's bought. And no one even knew he was doing this work. It's called fake estates. He was buying little gutter properties, little pieces of land that you could not occupy, and chipping away at the edifice of the city by buying these spaces. And the only reason we know about them is because she got a bill. And she said, what am I paying for? And he bought all these little plots of land. And then she found this document called Fake Estates. So there is a massive archive. You can go over to her house and look at it. And you can go to the Canadian Centre for Architecture and look at it too. But it isn't the work that would go to market. And so it's an archive because it's not an archive for capital. Yeah.
Mm.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
I think my question, if I can collapse back to the nothing. I feel maybe this is a question actually for everyone. Actually, everyone is that. It's actually I feel I don't have a question. The type of nothing comes to mind when I think. Actually, remember when we were in Sydney, Jack, and I said, actually, it's not about the entropy, it's about the syntropy. And it's like, I feel like the girls are like in this kind of syntropic state where they're actually turning back. Actually, it's actually in the, we were swimming, and I said, I looked to you, I said, I feel like I'm ruined. I feel like I'm the ruin in the, I'm this ruin in the empire, and I don't care. I actually this one's for you, Damon. It's like, let's go back to Brisbane. Like, what's the law of Damon's groove? Like that bird, like, you know, it's like that planet of that, like, it's directly to country to imagine like what would that nothing feel like. Maybe it's a feeling. I forgot your name, but
Sergio.
you Surge is in that place of like I'm gonna step up tonight. Thank you. It's if I may build a tower myself for a minute just to come back to this nothing. I actually came to the festival. I'm not everyone has a lot of things, but I personally have nothing, and that might be something. And you know when thinking about Octavia Butler, not Octavia, but St. Lauren, like maybe I don't want I want to be I don't want to be just someone one. And it's like that someone I want to be that someone nothing. That someone nothing in this space. And it's actually the tower that's leading into the empire. It's actually on this like space. I was in Bangkok and I saw split. And did you see the videos? The videos in Bangkok, and there was a shake. There was a shake. And this girl, she was in the pool, and she was she almost fell out of the pool. And it was from this tower, and we're building these towers, these ideas, and I just wanted to like interrupt a little bit. Blah 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 blah. If I may, Shodi gone. If I may. It's actually the body. When the body is in the space, it's actually. Remember, Jack? I said it's actually this. little rumination. May you stand up. May you hala. May you sit. Anything but sit. Do anything but sit. Okay, what we're gonna do today, we're gonna do a flower. So everyone put a chair. That's fashion. This is fashion. This is fashion now. I wanna see that. Unyielding. You make one